Hello, friends. This is Steve Taylor. I'm one of the illustrious crew at fthatnoisepod.com. For those of you who are unaware, I am also an author and have published 2 books in a 4-book series. This is book number 1, The Lockbox, and I've been working on it for the past 8 years. Now, in preparation for the third installment coming out hopefully soon, I thought it might be fun to read the first 2 books in a series of videos that I'll be posting on YouTube through our website, fthatnoisepod.com, and also my own personal webpage, staylorbooks.com. My plan of attack is to read 2 chapters because I figured after doing some practice rounds, 2 chapters equals about a half-hour video per, which should make it tolerable for anyone to have to listen to my voice. So it'll be 2 chapters per video and continuing into the third book. And if you like what you hear, The Lockbox, which is book 1, and Homecoming are both available on Amazon.com. You can either get them digitally or in paperback. Now, as always, anything on our website is brought to you by Trashman Media. Trashman Media, it is a video review site for films you might not see at your local Redbox. It is fantastic, and you can look up more at trashmanmedia.com. Also brought to you by Bizarre Abyss. It is a wonderful website dedicated to news and straight talk. Visit them at bizarreabyss.com. Now, do not forget to check our website every Monday night, fthatnoisepod.com, for a new episode of our podcast, F That Noise. Now, unlike these chapter readings, which are for, say, PG-13, the podcast is adult only, and I cannot stress that enough. Adult only. Okay. So now, bear with me. I have done this a few times, and it has failed miserably, but I am going to begin with the prologue of The Lockbox. November 21st, 1963, Bend, Oregon. The sun rose on another late fall morning. Winter's cruel touch had made an early appearance while blanketing the world in an unforgiving Arctic embrace. Each gust from the frigid tempest punished bearskin and transposed the landscape with every flake of snow it shifted. Through the veil of desolate cold, the small town of Bend was already beginning to stir after another night of peaceful slumber. The townsfolk had begun their daily routines, blissfully ignorant to the storm rising from within their borders. Unbeknownst to the people of this small town, a silent danger had moved in. Strangers had been seen skulking around the streets at night. They were journeymen without a sense of purpose, but always searching for something. The local authorities had heard stories, but the sheriff chalked them up to nothing more than just a few transients passing through. This town had seen its fair share of tough times in the past decade, and poverty wasn't anything new to the area. Even though the authorities had decided to look the other way, these drifters were being watched by someone. Every movement stalked by a master of deceit, the shadow of all shadows. If you asked those who came in contact with him, his description was always vague, jumbled. Some thought his age varied from early 20s to late 30s. He had been 6'3", 5'2", and even a woman. The truth is that no one had been able to recall with any certainty what this mystery man looked like. Yes, Gerald Simmons was the best at what he did. In a short amount of time, he had become the most talented spy the United States government had ever produced. It had been 3 years since Gerald entered the secretive world of the Central Intelligence Agency, and his natural abilities had made him an asset to this country. Being a slight man with no distinguishing features, Agent Simmons had quickly learned the necessary skills he would need to become the perfect reconnaissance tool. The international landscape had changed after the end of World War II. No longer could you count on looking your adversaries in the eye. Wars were now fought behind desks, the orders being given by politicians and crooks. This kind of warfare didn't need GIs. It needed average-looking men and women who could listen, watch, and act without detection. A ghost without a conscience is how his superiors described the modern soldier of the Cold War. Not quite the life he had envisioned when signing up for the Marines 8 years prior. At the ripe age of 26, Gerald still craved recognition. He desperately wanted to be perceived as the dangerous, suave spy that every woman swooned over. Unfortunately, he knew his place, and that lifestyle would have to remain a fantasy revisited each night in his dreams. It had been a couple weeks since he had been given somewhat obscure assignment of shadowing Sean Grieve, former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and they had been the longest 2 weeks of his young life. After spending 2 years working undercover in Moscow, Gerald was brought back to the States and given this task with very little information pertaining to his target. All he knew is that this man was of great interest to the agency and that every one of his movements needed to be strictly observed and promptly reported back to his superiors at Langley on a daily basis. Frustration had set in almost immediately. Gerald was trained to follow some of the most dangerous men in the world, and now he was babysitting a senior citizen in the middle of nowhere. Each day, Gerald had to stay attentive through the monotony of what was Sean's life. Sean was a solitary man who seldom ever associated with anyone. He was a large man in his mid-50s, and the passing of time had not been kind to him. His stringy, shoulder-length hair had turned a blinding shade of silver. Under his bushy salt and pepper beard, the lines that cut into his face carried a lifetime of stress and sorrow. He was the definition of a broken man, and Gerald pitied him at times. The information Gerald was about to dig up on his target before the mission did little to help him understand why Sean was so important. Born November 24th, 1906 in Boulder, Colorado, Sean had lived the American dream. He was an all-American football star who drew attention and admiration for his good looks and intelligence, along with his athletic heroics. After he graduated high school, Sean tried his hands at many different careers. He had worked as a masonry apprentice when the country had thrust into the Great Depression of 1929. After that, it only took a few months for the work to dry up, and he found himself on the streets. Having just married his high school sweetheart, Sean was burdened with more responsibilities, but no way to make a living. It was just after the birth of his first child in 1931 that he enlisted in the U.S. Army to help support his family. Following basic training, Sean was able to utilize his physical and intellectual gifts to help rise swiftly through the ranks. Soon after he attained the rank of captain, the Japanese launched their attack on Pearl Harbor, and America was thrust into World War II. As part of the 29th Infantry, Sean was decorated for valor due to his bravery during the D-Day invasion. His platoon was in the initial wave that landed on Omaha Beach, and it was only because of his quick thinking and leadership that 6 of his fellow soldiers made it home. Following the war, Sean retired from the Army. After retiring, he still had the urge to give back to his country, and this led him to seeking a place in the state government. It started with a brief turn as the Colorado State Comptroller. From there, it was a quick ascension for Sean into the heart of the political world. Sean's first bid for office in his home state of Colorado was successful. The next step secured him a Senate seat, and from there he never looked back. After cutting his teeth in the Senate for over a decade, Sean was asked to become the Deputy Secretary of Defense under Secretary Neil H. McElroy. He graciously accepted. He served diligently from 1957 to 1959, and then without warning resigned his post. There were always questions about why he left only a month before Secretary McElroy was to step down. The official explanation was illness due to stress. However, in reality, the details of his disappearance remained a mystery to both his friends and family. Sean had returned home from work on the afternoon of June 3rd, packed a bag, and just vanished. He left a wife, 3 children, a lucrative career, and all the power a man could desire, along with many questions that needed answering. Over the years since he left the government had spared no expense trying to locate him. The reasons for their unrelenting search were a mystery to Gerald, but every soldier learns early on to never question the men at the top. There were many false sightings, but since he remained at large, Sean appeared to be an elusive adversary. That was until 6 months ago when Sean would be discovered out of sheer dumb luck. It was during the yearly carnival that he had made the mistake of allowing his photo to be taken by a local reporter for the town. A few weeks passed and the photo found its way to Washington, precipitating the government into sending their best man to gather whatever information they could about their mystery fugitive. Unfortunately, the government was not the only party interested in locating Sean. Shortly after Gerald had arrived in Bend, others began to appear. Some he didn't know, others he had seen before. Bend, Oregon had quietly become the spy capital of the world. Blissfully unaware of the increasing flow of newcomers, Sean continued his normal schedule, and today had been as drab and uneventful as every other. After Sean finished his daily walk along the frozen Deschutes River, he visited Joe's diner for a late, solitary lunch. From there he made his way to the town library where he worked part-time under the alias Robert Klein. Following his return to Joe's for a small dinner, Sean headed back to his secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. Gerald followed him, parked just around the corner from the cabin. It was time to settle in for another lackluster evening. With the temperature now dropping below 20 degrees most nights, Gerald would stay until the lights went out. Then he would probably return to his dismal hotel room that he had called home since arriving. After doing the daily crossword puzzle, Gerald checked his watch. He had just a few more tedious hours to go, but little did he know that all hell was about to break loose. A steady snow had begun to fall, covering the streets in a blanket of fresh powder. In the distance, a pair of yellow headlights broke through the darkness. The curtain of snow helped disguise the vehicle until it pulled up outside of Sean's cabin. The large black Mercedes had extinguished its lights as it approached the softly lit structure, making sure that its final approach would go unnoticed. 3 men exited the vehicle, each one larger than the next. All 3 wore thick black trench coats with black fedoras pulled down over their eyes. The oppressive darkness and blowing snow made it difficult for Gerald to pinpoint any distinguishing features of the men. He could only make out the steam coming from their shadowy forms. The strangers approached the cabin and began pounding fiercely on the front door. After a few minutes, the largest of the 3 lifted his gigantic foot and busted through the red oak door. Following a short, tense silence, the men dragged Sean out by his hair and threw him into the snow. Witnessing the ferocity of the beating the men had begun to inflict on Sean, Gerald knew that he had to intervene, but to what extent was he willing to get involved? He could not afford to expose his cover, but if anything happened to Sean, Gerald would never be able to live with himself. When the monsters increased the volatile cadence of their blows, he realized he needed to act. After slowly exiting his vehicle, he crouched down next to the fender, waiting for the ideal moment to strike. With their backs turned to him, Gerald sprinted to the opposite side of the cabin and quietly made his way behind a stack of firewood adjacent to the brutal attack. 2 of the men were continuously kicking Sean, who now cowered in the fetal position on the ground. The 3rd man was standing just out of harm's way, observing the beating with a sadistic grin and sense of amusement. He barked orders to 2 larger thugs and screamed at Sean in a broken French accent, asking him where it was. Gerald crept stealthily behind the large man. He knew that timing would be everything, and he set a game plan in his head. Erupting at his target, Gerald swiftly snapped the interrogator's neck. Luckily, the 2 men enjoyed kicking Sean too much to notice the sudden silence. Regrouping his strength, Gerald leapt from the limp body of the first man to his next target. With a quick jab of his knife, he was able to slice the man's throat, and turn in time to block the attack of the 3rd and final assailant. Shoving the man back, Gerald had created enough space between them to deliver a brutal roundhouse kick to his head, knocking him unconscious. Leaping atop the motionless assailant, Gerald buried his knife into the large man's chest with a brutality and precision that only the most intense military training could prepare you for. Staggering back into the side of the snow-covered cabin, Gerald rested a minute, trying his best to absorb the macabre scene that lay before him. Shock would lead to disappointment and anger over the rookie mistake he had just made. His unbridled rage had left all the participants bleeding out into the softly falling snow. You will never get information from a dead man, and Gerald had many questions that needed answering. Snapping out of his daze, Gerald quickly rushed to Sean's side. Lying on a bed of crimson snow, Sean's face had been crushed with the blows delivered by the assailant's feet, his body bent and broken beyond recognition. Gerald fell to his knees and cradled his head. He did his best to comfort Sean, realizing that his wounds were most likely fatal. Try not to move, Mr. Grief. I'm here to help. With the shock of the situation still overwhelming to him, Gerald remained calm and continued to console the dying man. I'll get you out of here. Just hang on. Sean opened his swollen eyes and addressed the Savior. Please, is the only word Sean could muster, his jaw most certainly broken. Reaching out, he grabbed Gerald's arm in a fetal grip. Trembling, Sean reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope covered in fresh blood from the fractured rib now protruding from his chest. Handing it to Gerald, Sean is only able to utter 2 words. Keep safe. Gerald cautiously accepted the envelope just as Sean took his last breath. Realizing that he was gone, Gerald lowered Sean's head gently to the ground. As he stood and placed the envelope into his jacket, he paused and looked around at the carnage, knowing that it would be hard to explain the events to the local authorities. After one last remorseful glance at Sean's lifeless body, Gerald vanished into the night, the fresh canopy of snow covering any sign that he was ever there. And that is the end of the prologue. I thought that was pretty exciting. I thought that was the best writing I've ever read in my life. It does get better. Chapter 1. July 23rd, 2012, 2:35 p.m., Shoshone Peak, Wyoming. Oh, crap! These are the famous last words spoken by millions of children throughout the years. It's the phrase uttered upon realizing that once your parents have found out what they did, their lives might just be over. Samuel Lana stood over a sea of broken glass. He ran his fingers through his shaggy blonde hair and cursed under his breath. At 6'3" and 195 pounds, the 16-year-old was an easy target when blame was being passed around. Every time he got angry, things around him had a tendency to go boom. He kicked the remains of the bay window that used to accent the lovely sitting room in which he stood. The same room his parents had spent the last 2 years decorating with antiques from around the world. Glass shards now littered the beautiful oak floor, which had been polished to a brilliant shine only 3 days prior. After briefly pondering the mess he was in, Sam turned and looked down the hall at his accomplice, his sister Emily. "Now you did it, dumbass!" "Don't you try pinning this on me," Emily shouted back as she entered the room. She was grinning from ear to ear as she walked over to Sam. Though she was a year younger and half his size, Emily was notoriously apt at weaseling her way out of trouble and that she usually caused. "If it wasn't for you being a jerk, I wouldn't have thrown that mug at your stupid head in the first place. Well, maybe if you kept your nose out of my damn business, I wouldn't have had to tweet a picture of you on the toilet." Sam pushed his sister, easily sending her much smaller frame crashing into the arm of the couch and off onto a side table. Emily quickly recovered and sprang to her feet like a well-trained ninja. Her jet-black hair slashed through the air as she swung her left leg into Sam's torso, knocking him back onto the couch. Leaping on top of him, she began beating his head with her fists. In self-defense, Sam instinctively smacked her in the nose with the palm of his hand. Emily's head whipped back as she screamed in agony, blood spraying all over the couch. Responding to the crash and subsequent arguing of her children, Megan Lana raced through the room. Being a petite woman in her late 30s, Megan is not what you would call an intimidating figure. But when she is pushed, watch out. "What the hell is going on in here?" she howled. As Megan turned the corner into her precious sitting room, she was shocked to see the empty frame where the shattered window once sat. Scanning the room, she focused on the 2 children who she once loved, wrestling on her $2,000 white leather couch, now littered with glass and blood. Realizing that the mother had entered the room, Emily and Sam stopped dead in their tracks and slowly looked into the face of their own reckoning. Backing away from each other, the kids bowed their heads and braced for the inevitable storm. Megan took a moment to absorb all that she had just witnessed. She studied the room, the empty pane, followed by the glorious couch in which she found peace in her daily naps, and finally her antique end table from Egypt, which used to have 4 legs. Then she looked at her children with a burning feeling of rage and mixed with crushing disappointment. The veins in her neck had begun pulsating to the point that it appeared her head might explode. Taking a deep breath, Megan tried to wipe the tears from the corner of her eyes, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "I don't want any excuses from either of you," she patiently instructed the culprits, trying desperately to remain calm. "I just want this mess cleaned up now." Punctuating her last word to get the desired result, Megan turned and left the room, the shock still overwhelming. Knowing that the fallout from this incident was far from over, Emily and Sam began to clean their mess, both kids glaring at each other as they worked. 4:30 p.m., Thomas Jefferson High School. Roger Lana enjoyed this time of day more than any other. He had spent the last 6 hours working with the coaching staff and his players to hopefully build the next great powerhouse in high school football. But now he was alone, on the field, left with his thoughts. For the last 15 years, he had been a teacher and coach at Jefferson High. After growing up in New York City for the first 18 years of his life, this small town in rural Wyoming had become his Eden. Following his graduation from high school, he was accepted to Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. After 5 long years of studying, he would receive his master's degree in education, but more importantly, it was over this time that he would meet his beautiful wife and soulmate, Megan. 3 months before they both graduated from college, the unexpected happened when Megan became pregnant with their first child. After graduation, the young couple made their choice to move back to Megan's hometown of Shoshone Peak, just north of Rock Springs, Wyoming. A few months after moving to town, the new parents of a healthy baby boy were both able to secure teaching jobs. Megan teaching 3rd grade at Westridge Elementary School, and Roger at the high school as a biology teacher and assistant football coach. Following many years of hard work and tireless commitment, Roger had become the head football coach and proud leader of the defending 2-time state champions. From now on, none of that mattered. It was just him and the beautiful skyline that he had grown accustomed to. Unfortunately, he had become so lost in his own thoughts that his phone vibrating in his pocket had gone unnoticed. Walking to his beloved dark green Dodge Ram pickup, he removed his phone from his jacket pocket, checking the time. He immediately realized his error in judgment when the 8 missed calls from his wife flashed on the screen. Before he dialed home, Roger decided to check his lone voicemail and find out exactly what he might be walking into. "Why the hell do you have your goddamn phone on silent again? How many times do I have to tell you not to do?" Megan's voice was still ringing in his ear as he set the phone on the passenger seat. The message would continue for another 2 minutes, concluding with a very straightforward statement. "If you are not here in the next 10 minutes, I will drive down there and drag you home by your ears." Knowing that his wife was not the kind of person to throw out idle threats, Roger began the long journey home. Taking one last look at the picturesque, peaceful horizon, he prepared himself for what he could only imagine was World War III. Roger pulled his truck into the driveway, immediately noticing the gaping hole where the front window once sat. He got out of his truck and walked over to the open hole in the wall. As he picked through the glass shards that remained stuck in the window pane, Roger could feel his blood begin to boil. Now what the hell is this? Finally beginning to understand the reasoning behind Megan's meltdown, he brushed the glass off of his hands and charged the front door, preparing to enter the fray. Having worked up some scenarios in his head prior to entering, Roger was not ready for what he saw when he stormed through the front door. Sitting calmly next to one another at the dining room table were his daughter Emily and son Sam, both covered in sweat and blood. Sam was sporting a black eye and a nasty cut on his left cheek, while Emily seemed mostly unscathed, except for a small bandage covering her left nostril that trickled blood. The expressions on their faces told the story of what had occurred after the obvious fracas. Their heads were slightly bowed, and Roger could see the puffiness around both of their eyes from tears recently shed. At the head of the table sat his beloved wife, Megan. Her beautiful blonde hair was now a tangled mess encompassing her face like wrinkled drapery. Her eyes had a ring of fiery red enveloping the stunning blue, and they pulsated with a repressed anger. She was dressed in coveralls, and she still clenched the brush she used in her right hand, the paint long since dry. Without a word, Megan looked up at Roger with a piercing glare that caused him to recoil in fear. With her left hand, she motioned for him to sit at the end of the table, never uttering a word. Roger sat across from her, and as he opened his mouth to speak, Megan raised a finger to silence him. Roger understood the gesture and quickly retracted. Megan sighed deeply, looking first at both her children, then back at Roger. "Now that we are all here," Megan began at just above a whisper, "I think it's best if we discuss the events of our day. Roger, would you like to begin?" "I think we need," were the only words of protest he could muster before Megan cut him off with one very defiant word. "No!" She stared at Roger, her hand trembling with anger. Megan raised her hand to her brow and pushed back her bangs. I want to hear about your day, honey, she said in a deceptively sweet tone. Reluctant at first, Roger quickly realized it was in his best interest to follow his wife's guidance. Well, we had a fine practice today. The coaches and I think the defense will be stronger in the secondary this season, which, as you know, has been a weakness the last few seasons. Unfortunately, we need to tighten. As usual, Roger was getting overly excited about the team to understand that he was digging a very deep hole for himself. As he rambled on, the anger grew within Megan and was about to reach its boiling point, but she patiently waited for him to finish his story. Finally catching on, Roger cut a choice short mid-sentence and cleared his throat. So, you going to tell me what's happening here? Oh, why thank you for asking, my love. I would just like to say how pleased I am that your day went so well. Mine, on the other hand, was unfortunately not so pleasant. Megan brushed the hair from her face and adjusted herself in the chair, putting on a fake smile. After you left this morning, I treated myself to a wonderful breakfast out by the pond. From there, I took a soothing bath and prepared to finish my latest project in peace. Megan looked over her children, a maniacal grin growing across her face. I was sitting in my studio, painting, relaxing, then without warning, a deafening crash echoed through the house. Rushing to the living room, I was half expecting to see a car sitting on our couch. For that could be the only thing that could cause that much of a racket. With her grin quickly turning into a scowl, Megan pointed an accusatory finger at Sam and Emily. But to my surprise, she continued with growing aggression in her tone, I find your two children strangling each other on top of my little couch. Between the blood and the screaming, it took me a second to notice the hole where our window used to be. Megan reached up and wiped a tear from her eye. Composing herself, she looked back at Roger and raised her hands to the sky. I just don't know what to do anymore. You're gone all day, while I'm here trying to keep these two from killing each other. I can't take their constant bickering. Megan leaned forward in her chair and pleaded with her husband. So what I need from you is a little help before I lose what's left of my sanity. Can you do that for me, please? Roger stared at his wife, speechless. Sam looked up from the table and began to speak, but was cut off when Roger pointed his finger at him. Not a word from you. He shifted his attention away from Megan and focused every ounce of his steely gaze onto Sam and Emily with a quiet fury. Now listen, and listen good. I have no choice but to be at school every day for practice, and that means you both are under the supervision of your mother. But by golly, even though I am not here, that doesn't mean I'm not here. Do you both read me, or do I need to spell it out for you further? Sam and Emily quickly glanced at each other, both trying not to laugh at their father's last statement. Even though he was in his early 40s, the kids have always been blown away at his corny way of expressing his anger. Sensing their lack of focus, Roger smacked the table in an attempt to regain his children's attention and to stress the importance of the conversation. With the growing inferno now smoldering in his glare, he continued, Now, for the next 3 weeks, it will be both of your responsibilities to not only work off the cost of replacing the couch and window, but to focus on regaining the trust of both me and your mother. Roger sat back and grabbed the side of the table, bracing himself for the backlash from the next statement. This also means that you are both to give up your cell phones, and neither of you are leaving this yard for any reason. As expected, this sent Sam and Emily into hysterics. Sam leapt to his feet and focused a wave of unbridled fury on his father. What? I can't believe you! He shouted while wiping the saliva that had begun to fly from his mouth. How am I going to explain this to Cindy? 3 weeks apart will be the kiss of death for us. Joe Stafford has already tried to hook up with her when we went to Grandma's last month. I might as well break up with her now and save us both the trouble. As Sam laid into Roger, Emily turned her full attention to Megan. Mom, you can't be serious, okay, with this? I'm literally died without my phone. This is beyond unfair. For the few moments, Roger and Megan let Sam and Emily vent their frustrations. When he had enough, Roger stood and gently tapped the glass in front of him with his fork. The sudden noise drew Sam and Emily's attention back towards their father. Understanding the purpose of her father's action, Emily sat back down while pulling Sam back into his chair along the way. Roger stared into the eyes of his two children. "Now that I have your attention, let me say one more thing." Towering over Sam and Emily, Roger lowered his voice to barely a whisper, trying to increase the effect of the next few words. "I am not asking you to do this. You are grounded. You will give up your phones, and you will obey every word your mother and I say to you. Is that understood?" Realizing the futility of voicing any more objections, Sam and Emily sulked down in their seats, both defeated. Sam, teeming with repressed rage, looked over at Roger. "Can we be excused, please?" "Up to your room for the rest of the night," Roger demanded. "I will have a list for you in the morning with your first day's chores." Sam was first to rise, followed by his sister. As they made their way out of the dining room, Sam turned back towards Roger and Megan and said the three words that all parents dread hearing. "I hate you." And that was the end of chapter 1. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the first episode. We are going to be doing one of these a week. When I'm doing it, I'm planning on having them released on Mondays along with the podcast. So look for them every Monday. And like I said, we're going to be doing the first book, which is the Lockbox. We're going to go into the second book, which is Homecoming. And by the time these videos are complete, I'm hoping to have the third book finished. Working title is Mama, and you'll understand that title as we go along. But I thank you all for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.